Well, forced exile, grief, the pressures of assimilation, and even generational trauma. These are recurring themes for many, if not most, tales of the refugee experience. And they're also at the heart of Cecile Pin's first book, Wandering Souls, which recounts the perhaps lesser known stories of Vietnamese boat people, in this case, 3 orphans who fled to the United Kingdom. She joins me now on set for Perspective. Cecile, thank you for joining us. Congratulations again for the publishing of your first book. Now, you published this at a pretty impressive young age, if I'm correct. So what brought you to this theme?
Sure. So the book is partly based on family history. So like in the book, my mom was a Vietnamese boat person who left her country after the war and settled not in the UK but in France. And so I wrote most of the book during lockdown when, like a lot of people, I had a bit more free time. And I think it came at a time as well when I was, in my mid-20s and wanting to learn more about my identity. And so the book came about from both personal experience and also lots of research that I did on my own to learn more about the boat people.
Well, that brings me to the next question, which is that you've got, like you said, parts of your own family history with your own meticulous research. What was the process like to kind of mix the micro with the macro? Was your family involved in the research process as well and able to kind of accompany you and tell you what parts of the macro history they witnessed themselves?
Mm-hmm. So because my mom went to France and I decided to set the book in the UK because I think both mentally and also as a writer, it kind of gave me more freedom to make the characters and the story its own thing. So I asked my mom some questions, but I also really wanted to separate the two in some ways. So a lot of it was, because it was during lockdown as well, lots of it was just doing research on my own home and looking at national archives and newspaper from the time and also testimonies from refugees and looking at photos and videos as well, so I could get the details right.
Is there if you don't mind me asking, a reason as to why you wanted to kind of really make this novel independent, make it its own story, different, integrating elements from your own family story, but not sticking 100% to that?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a lot that I don't know as well from my own family history, and I think I was very interested in exploring the kind of the role of the novelist in filling in those gaps. And I wanted to also set the book in the UK because I've been living there for almost 10 years now, and there are so few stories about the Vietnamese diaspora in the UK, much less so than in France or in the US. So I also wanted to make the story fictional because of that reason.
And in your research precisely, do you find that there's something that sets the Vietnamese experience in the UK apart specifically than the Vietnamese experience in places like the US and France, where we're a bit more accustomed to hearing about?
Yeah, I think the diaspora is smaller. It's hard to get exact numbers, but I think that the numbers of refugees that the UK took in was more about 20,000, whereas in the US it's more in the 6 figures, and same in France. So it's smaller, and I think so it sometimes made it harder for the Vietnamese community to feel at home. It was a bit of a longer process, and it was interesting as well when doing my own research to kind of look into the Thatcher response and the kind of time that the UK was experiencing, which was a lot of political and societal upheaval. So it was interesting to kind of try and put the refugee crisis in that context as well.
Speaking of Thatcher, she's probably arguably most known, obviously, for her economic policies. But what about immigration? I mean, she's not a leader that you think of having particularly extreme immigration policies. How does that figure into your book?
Yes, so I'm in no way an expert of Thatcher's policies or anything, but it was interesting when looking it up to see that she had written a letter to a little Vietnamese boy saying how she wanted to reassure him that they were going to welcome lots of their refugees and be a really welcoming country. But then in minutes that were recently released in 2009, we could tell that privately she held different views and was much more keen to welcome refugees that came from Europe and was quite reluctant to welcome the boat people.
Many ways that probably hasn't changed. Through your research, the process of writing your book, what do you think are some of the lesser known parts of the Vietnamese boat people experience?
I think, at least for me, I was quite surprised. Well, I knew that the journey was a very difficult one, but just to learn that the scale of those difficulties and learning about the sexual assault they would experience and the death was quite, shocking and harrowing to read about and to write about. And then I think just knowing that it to this day as well, in 2019, I think there was the Essex lorry death where some Vietnamese people perished while trying to immigrate to the UK. So just kind of seeing the cycle and the story re-novel itself.
You cover themes like grief, generational trauma, and without revealing too much, you still have a hopeful ending. How do you find balance between the kind of obviously dark realities of being a refugee, having to flee your country, and the need for optimism?
Yeah. It was very important to me not to just write a kind of trauma story and to really make sure that the book was, joyful and hopeful in some ways. I think having a narrator that are quite young helped in that process because I wanted to infuse some of that, childhood naivety in the book. So, for example, there's a moment where they discover snow for the first time, and that's quite, you see them kind of regress to that state of being children, which was lovely. And then always, I don't want to give away the ending, but making sure that the book just ended on a note that healing is possible.
And you mentioned a narrator there. One of the narrators in your book is a ghost. It's not necessarily a common type of narrator to have. Why integrate this type of character?
I think ghosts play a very important part in Vietnamese culture as well. We really every year, I lit some incense for my ancestors and so on. So I really wanted to include that aspect of Vietnamese culture in the book, and it's also a reference to the title Wandering Souls, which Operation Wandering Souls was an operation that the U.S. Army undertook during the Vietnam War, which kind of played on the Vietnamese belief that if you don't bury your dead properly, then they'll be left to wander as ghosts for eternity on Earth. So it's also a little play on that operation that the U.S. Army undertook. And I also just love seeing how ghosts play such a big role in different cultures, and how, when you're little, you might be afraid of ghosts, but actually as you grow up, at least for me, I realized that ghosts can also be a reassuring thing.
You studied philosophy, if I'm correct. I'm curious to know whether or not your studies informed the lens through which you see and write about the immigrant experience, especially because we're accustomed, especially today, to hearing, sociologists, historians, et cetera, but it's hard to find philosophical perspectives on modern conceptions of identity. Did that help you in the writing process?
I think it especially helped in the writing about grief. I studied philosophers like Martha Nussbaum, who's a U.S. philosopher, who talked a lot about as I mentioned, the cultural aspect of grief. So that was very helpful, I believe. And then I'm sure it affected my writing in kind of ways that I'm not super conscious about. But it was great to have those studies at hand.
Perhaps as a last question for you, Cecile, what do you have planned for the future? This is just your first book. I imagine you've got others planned.
Yes, so I'm slowly starting work on my second novel, which will be, I think, more contemporary, and maybe have a bit of a love story element to it. But it's still early stages.
We'll be looking forward to seeing it. Cecile Pin, author of Wandering Souls. We've just got the French copy here, Les âmes errantes, but it's also available in English, of course, as well. Cecile Pin, thank you very much.
Thank you.